for joining us for Community Progress's Vacant, Abandoned, and Deteriorating or Bad Property Academy, and for this session, which is going to focus on the basics of creating a more strategic and equitable code enforcement program. Welcome back for lunch, or welcome for the first time if you're just joining us for this session. So my name is Benton, and I serve as Associate Counsel to National Initiatives at Community Progress. In this role, I help communities across the country address their bad property challenges through our Technical Assistance Program, which provides customized assistance on topics including property tax enforcement, strategic code enforcement, and land banking. Before joining Community Progress, I worked as a legal aid attorney for 10 years in Massachusetts and Michigan, and I represented low-income homeowners facing mortgage and property tax foreclosure and low-income tenants and tenants associations, often in cases to secure repairs. In that role, I saw the incredible power of code enforcement and the incredible difference that code enforcement officers and departments can make in the lives of their residents and their city's residents, from getting a vacant lot that's attracting rodents and crime cleaned up, to helping tenants secure health and safety repairs that they had been asking their landlord for months, if not years. So at Community Progress, after joining Community Progress, I have been so excited to learn about how cities across the country are thinking about how they can take this powerful tool of code enforcement and find ways to do it even more effectively, efficiently, and equitably. And that's what I'm going to be talking with you about today. Really thinking about ways that your city can use, redeploy the resources and tools that you have. And I'm excited to share some of the best practices and lessons that Community Progress has learned from cities across the country that hopefully you can take back to your communities. So great. Let's dive right in. So today I'm going to spend about 45 minutes giving a basic introduction to strategic code enforcement, and I'm going to save about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. My slides and a recording of this presentation are going to be shared in the weeks after the Academy. And at the end, I have and I'm going to add links to any studies or resources that I reference to these slides. And I also, I'll try to put them in the chat as I go. I don't know how well that will work out, but I'll give that a try. And I also want to add that this is an area where we at Community Progress are always learning, and that we know that cities across the country are doing great and innovative work in this area. So if you know, or if your city, or if you know of any great examples of the strategies or programs that I'm talking about, feel free to pop links to those or mention them in the chat to share the resources that I know you all have with the others on this webinar. Oh, sorry about that. So here we go. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So this is a real, the focus here is 101. So first I'm going to talk about what is code enforcement and what are its goals. And then I'm going to talk about what has code enforcement traditionally looked like in many cities, and what are the challenges that cities face when implementing this more traditional approach. And then I'm going to move on to talking about an alternative, which is strategic code enforcement, and cover some of the basic elements of a more strategic approach to code enforcement and share some examples along the way. And I want to note here at the get-go that there's absolutely no city in the country that's doing everything right, or that we can point to say, this is the model you can follow. And there's not going to be a list of things that you all could start doing tomorrow that's automatically going to help your system be more strategic and equitable. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this work, and it'll really depend on what are the challenges and assets in your community, in your community's unique history, challenges, and assets, and what you learn when you really dig into your data and get input from your residents about the bad property challenges. So my goal with this presentation is really to be sharing ideas and resources that can helpfully start you down a path to wanting to learn more and take steps to move in a more strategic direction. So great, let's get started. So first, the basics, what is code enforcement? So when we're talking about code enforcement at Community Progress, we're talking about the entire system of laws and policies that are used by local governments to help ensure healthy and safe neighborhoods. And I want to start by giving a shout out to our code enforcement officers or inspectors, many of whom I think might be on this, might be listening in, because they play a critical and foundational role in any code enforcement system. They're out on the ground every day. They know what's happening in their neighborhoods, and they develop deep relationships with the property owners and neighbors that they work with. But code enforcement officers don't work alone. They're supported by other city departments, including community and economic development departments, legal departments, the data and IT staff, and courts. The legal office, court staff, and judges are all part of the system of code enforcement. And while code enforcement has often been viewed as a way to police properties or regulate properties, it can and it should be considered a tool to do so much more. It's a way to protect and improve the health of a city's residents, a tool to help preserve naturally occurring affordable housing for homeowners and renters, and to help stabilize and revitalize neighborhoods. So great, moving on to talking about what are the goals of code enforcement. So the goal of any property code enforcement program should be to create healthy and safe properties and neighborhoods by ensuring properties are in compliance with local housing and building codes. And to do all that in the most effective, efficient, and equitable means possible. If you have good housing and building codes, compliance means, with those codes means that the places where your residents live and work are healthy and safe, and your neighborhoods are stable. This might all seem a little obvious, but so I think it's helpful to point out what we would say the goals of code enforcement shouldn't be. And those goals shouldn't be to issue a certain number of citations a year, to get a certain number of court orders or a certain number of demolitions, or especially it shouldn't be to generate a certain amount of revenue for your city from fines and costs, even though we recognize that oftentimes these are the metrics that the success of code departments are measured on. Gaining consensus within your city that the goal of code enforcement should be compliance as opposed to punishment or one of these other factors or any of the other things I mentioned is a critical first step to moving in the direction of more strategic code enforcement. So great. So with that definition of the goals of code enforcement in mind, I want to talk about what code enforcement has traditionally looked like in many communities, and think about and talk about what we've heard from cities about what the challenges with this traditional approach has been, and to talk about those challenges through the framework of thinking about whether this approach to code enforcement is effective, efficient, or equitable. So first, I want to talk about what does traditional code enforcement look like. And I have to start by acknowledging that code enforcement is going to look different in every city, in large part because every city is going to be working within a different local and state law framework. and has a different history and has a different history of code enforcement. And the little summary that I'm going to give right now is a vast oversimplification. And before I dive in, I also want to acknowledge that many of these existing code enforcement frameworks were designed with the best of intentions. They were designed to try to use limited resources effectively, to try to be responsive to residents' complaints, and trying to apply the codes fairly and uniformly to all different types of property owners. So, all of those caveats aside, all of that said, the general overview of traditional code enforcement that we see is, in many cities, it starts with a complaint. These complaints also about property conditions, and these often come in through 311 systems, phone calls, emails, and these complaints can often be made anonymously. And in many cities, and these complaints will come in, and where there's resources, inspectors will go out immediately, regardless of the type of property owner, and do an inspection to follow up on the complaint. If the officer finds a violation, in many cities, they immediately issue a citation, which can carry financial penalties. And then those citations often give the property owner a period of time to comply. If the owner doesn't comply, then the next step is often filing a case in administrative or the local state court system. Many cities will often obtain liens against properties, but often these liens are ignored by owners, especially if they are for more than what the property is worth. And many cities take pride in applying the same process and approach to every property, regardless of the type of owner or property characteristics or neighborhood market. And this approach is really centered around using criminal and civil penalties, if we're using the analogy of carrots and sticks, as a stick to get property owners to comply. The idea is that property owners will keep their properties in compliance to avoid these penalties, or quickly bring them into compliance to avoid further penalties. So I'd love to think with you about, what are some of the challenges you face if you have worked in a city where you're applying this approach, or currently trying to get code compliance through this types of approach. So first of all, is this system effective? Does it result in properties being brought into compliance? And I'll be honest, the threat of civil and criminal penalties does work for some homeowners. I'll admit that the front of my house currently has some peeling paint and a broken gutter. And the reason that I haven't fixed it is that I'm not handy, and it's a real pain in the butt right now to try to find a contractor that's reliable and affordable. And so if I was to get a citation from my city, I'd probably not be happy about it. I'd probably be happier if they gave me a list of contractors that I could call, but I wouldn't be happy, but it would motivate me. But that's because I have the resources and I live in a place with a neighborhood with a strong housing market. So it's worth my investment to get those repairs made. But I'm not the type of property owner that you're worried about. I want to talk about two types of property owners of bad properties that we hear about all the time from cities. The first is limited liability companies. And we hear all the time about the challenges of applying the traditional approach to LLCs and out-of-state property owners. It's a pain to figure out who the owner actually is, how to get them served. And even if you can find them, LLCs are set up to insulate people from civil and criminal liabilities. So that threat just doesn't have much of an impact. And in very weak markets, just racking up violations and ignoring them and eventually walking away from the process might even be part of their business model. So this approach just oftentimes just isn't effective. for these types of owners. And then the second type is owner occupants. Unlike me, the reason that many property owners have violations is not because they're lazy, it's because they don't have the resources to make the repairs. And hitting these homeowners with civil penalties or making them take time off from work to go to court isn't going to help get those repairs made any faster. And criminal charges or a conviction are really the last thing that these property owners need. It would only make it harder for them to get a job or access housing in the future. So in both of these cases, the focus of traditional code enforcement on the threat of civil and criminal penalties isn't going to get you to the compliance that you want. So next, let's think about the challenges of efficiency. This on the screen is a chart from an engagement we did with local partners in Gary, Indiana. I'll put a link to that report here in the chat. And what this chart shows that, again, these are the outcomes of cases where citations were issued for code violations. So you'll see there was some compliance. 18% of properties were brought into compliance, but an overwhelming 70% of cases, the citations were either undeliverable or ignored. And so all the resources that went into getting the complaints, going out inspecting, re-inspection, serving the citations, got these properties no closer to compliance. And further research as part of this engagement showed that 37% of these citations were actually being issued on properties that were severely tax delinquent and likely abandoned. So these resources were being used again and again on properties where the threat of civil and criminal penalties could have no effect. There wasn't even an owner to become aware of the citations or make the repairs. So next, let's think about whether traditional code enforcement is equitable. And this map is a map from an engagement we did in Toledo. And I'll put a link to that report in the chat box. And this map really shows that the city's code enforcement resources, their code enforcement citations, were concentrated in communities of color. And so the question to think about is this system fair? And I have 3 points here. The first is that we should think historically about why many of these properties are in a state of disrepair. Our country has a history of racist laws and policies that have resulted in disinvestment in communities of color and a concentration of bad properties in these neighborhoods and communities. These include redlining, urban renewal, racially restrictive covenants, and they've prevented people of color from gaining access, often prevented people of color from gaining access to the resources they need to rehab and rehabilitate their properties. And it's not all historic. Even today, a Fannie Mae study from earlier this year of 1.8 million appraisals conducted for mortgage refinance applications in 2019 and 2020 found that white-owned homes received higher appraisals relative to the automated valuation models. So that's more money in the pockets of white homeowners for things like rehab and repair. I'll put the link to that study in the chat. Great. And so my takeaway here in thinking about the systemic is to think about the systemic inequalities that are causing these bad properties. And if code enforcement is concentrated in these neighborhoods and not done strategically, code enforcement can exacerbate and reinforce the systemic inequalities instead of finding ways to address it. So a second point to consider when thinking about whether traditional code enforcement is equitable is really thinking about a complaint-based system. A complaint-based system can lead to over-enforcement against homeowners of color. especially for quality of life violations. And property maintenance or code violation complaints can even be weaponized by neighbors or outside investors, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods, to try to get longtime homeowners to sell. Another drawback of a solely complaint-based model is it leads to the under-enforcement where it's needed most, such as in rental properties with serious health and safety violations. Low-income tenants who are often single women of color with children who live in substandard apartments are, often the least likely to complain about the conditions because they know that doing so could result in the loss of their housing, either through retaliatory eviction, a landlord refusing to renew their lease, or from the code enforcement action themselves if the property is ultimately deemed uninhabitable. But at the same time, it's these tenants who often face the biggest lifelong risks from these health and safety violations, including the potential for lead poisoning or asthma triggers. So that's a summary of some of the challenges that cities tell us they face when they're applying a more traditional approach to code enforcement. And these are some of the challenges that I see in the chat that you all are agreeing with, that you're seeing in your everyday work. So I want to talk about what is the alternative. And an alternative is strategic code enforcement. And strategic code enforcement really involves gaining an understanding of your city's housing markets and owner and property characteristics to develop a code enforcement priorities and then to develop strategies to meet those priorities. Strategic code enforcement really encourages you to think about how to use your city's limited resources to have the biggest impact. And it involves collaborating with other city departments and trying to identify partners in the community that you can use to leverage your limited resources. And strategic code enforcement really seeks to shift the framework from thinking about a code enforcement process that's focused on penalties and instead developing a process that's focused on encouraging voluntary compliance by property owners, facilitating voluntary compliance by property owners, or where that voluntary compliance isn't going to be possible, in developing strategies that transfer those properties to new, more responsible owners. Sorry. Great. So moving on to the next slide. Strategic code enforcement, as I mentioned, is an area where there's a lot of innovation and a lot of dimensions, and cities across the country have developed a lot of different policies and programs to implement more strategic code enforcement. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I tried to narrow the idea down into 3 basic ideas that you can take back with you. The first is to try to use data and resident input to understand your bad property problems and then set priorities. Then the second tenet is to develop data-driven, proactive strategies tailored to each different type of owner and property and neighborhood markets that is focused on compliance first. To put it briefly, different strategies for different properties. And then finally, the third basic idea is to improve coordination within your local government and develop external partnerships to leverage your limited resources. And again, I will provide some examples along the way and try to provide links to those. And the map on this slide is Toledo again, and it shows, a really basic first step. It maps out where are the top census tracts where code enforcement is concentrated and what are the median home prices in those census tracts. Sorry, I keep saying great. Okay, the first basic tenet. So we're going to go through each of these tenets in turn. The first idea is to use data and resident input to understand your bad problems and set your priorities. And as I mentioned at the get-go of this section, strategic code enforcement starts with the assumption that no city has all the resources to address all of its bad property problems. And you need to dig into this data and talk to your residents and community organizations to figure out what you're going to prioritize with your limited resources. And so first, I'll talk about the data, though they're both resident input and data are equally important. But diving into the data, you'll see the first column here, the types of data you could gather is about the parcels themselves, the properties themselves. The second set is about market data. And market data, understanding what's happening with each neighborhood market is really fundamental. Because it's going to determine what strategy is going to work best for each type of across the property types to get you compliance. So if you think about a deteriorating vacant property, if the neighborhood, even if it's deteriorating and vacant, if the neighborhood market is strong, if you are sending notices of violations and imposing penalties, that property owner, if they're still around, that might result in compliance because that property owner in a strong market would be willing to put in the money to make the repairs to protect their investment. If that same vacant, deteriorating property is in a weak market neighborhood, especially if the penalties and costs of rehab exceed the value of the property, you can send all the notices and issue all of the citations that you want, but they would be more likely not to have an effect, and the owner would be more likely to just walk away. But that is a very brief overview. And if you want to know more about using data to understand your neighborhood markets, please stay tuned this afternoon for Community Progress Senior Fellow Alan Malick's presentation at 3:15 on using data to understand markets. I do want to put in a really good example. It's from Lucas County Land Bank of a land banker city that has really used parcel data and market data to understand their neighborhood markets and their vacant property challenges. And their survey, this is their 2021 Toledo survey, and it has the very great tagline, "What gets measured gets dealt with," which I love, and I think is really true. So that's data. Let's also think about social data. This means gathering input from the people who live and work in the neighborhoods most impacted by bad properties. So think about the people who are living in these properties, interacting with people who live in the properties, going inside the properties on a regular basis. This is residents, tenants, your fire department, neighborhood associations, realtors, agencies that administer housing vouchers and emergency rental assistance, social service agencies, legal aid providers. I was when I was a legal aid attorney working locally, it was the community health department nurses which first raised the alarm about really serious conditions of disrepair in a multifamily subsidized, privately owned development, and who, with the tenant's consent, brought those to the attention of legal aid and the code enforcement officers, because they were going in, they were nurses that were helping new moms with infants and young children, and the conditions of the floors were so bad that the children, the babies, were developmentally delayed because they didn't have anywhere to crawl around. So just really think about who's out there in these neighborhoods who know about the problems of the properties and who understand what are the real problem properties, what's the neighborhood's history, what's working, and what are potential resources that can be brought to bear on these issues. And while you're exploring the data, also evaluate any data that you have on your existing system. Is what you're doing having an impact? What's your compliance rate? So then a really critical piece is not just gathering this data, but analyzing it. So thinking about, based on the data that you have, what types of properties are causing the most harm. Is it vacant lots? Is it vacant property? Is it vacant structures? Is it rentals? Are these properties concentrated somewhere? Is there one neighborhood where you could really tackle just a few problem properties and make a big impact? Or is this a citywide issue? And is this going to be focused on health and safety concerns for renters, or is this going to be focused on neighborhood stabilization? And where can you're not going to be able to do anything you're not going to be able to do everything. So think about where your limited resources can have the biggest impact, and get feedback from your community on where they think that is. And so once you've developed these priorities, use the data that you have to track and measure and communicate your progress and success. And you might think that you can't do this unless you have expensive software, and good software can help with this data gathering and analysis. But we've worked with small cities that don't even have all of their parcels digitized, who had a volunteer windshield survey where volunteers went out and gathered data on the conditions of various properties. And you can use Microsoft Excel and Access to gather and catalog this data and analyze it. And Alan Malik, I'll mention Alan Malik again. He has a great publication, Neighborhood by Numbers, that talks about sources of data that are publicly available and ways to analyze this to understand your bad property challenges. And the flip side is that we've also worked with cities that have beautiful software programs to gather all sorts of data. And they have these great dashboards with the data, but they haven't used it. They haven't analyzed it, or asked residents to look through it, or asked their code enforcement department to look, or code enforcement officers to look at it, to really think about use it to understand their problems and set priorities. So next, so our next basic idea of strategic code enforcement is developing different enforcement strategies for different based on the different property owners, property types, and neighborhood markets. And I want to acknowledge here that any of the strategies developed and tools deployed, the strategies and tools available to each city are going to vary, especially based on state law. And state law can be a benefit, or it can be a barrier to implementing these types of strategies to improve code enforcement. So, for example, in some states, code liens can be collected like delinquent property taxes, which is a benefit if you are looking to transfer vacant and abandoned properties to new ownership. In other states, as an example, as a barrier, other states prevent local governments from doing proactive rental inspections or other forms of rental regulation, and that's going to prove to be a barrier that might need to be worked around or overcome. So when you're thinking, so I raised that point to say that strategies are going to vary based on your legal landscape. But as I think Alan made this point in his very first presentation today, when you're doing this work, don't just think about what you can change. You might be identifying some state legislative changes that might need to be made, that you might need to talk about. You might want to reach out to other cities in your state facing similar challenges to see if there are changes that need to be made at the state level to give you the tools that you need to do this work. Okay, so looking at the different types. So I've listed some examples of some strategies that could be brought to bear on 3 different types of properties here. And you'll notice that the first point of these strategies is creating a mechanism to identify the types of properties. And this is where the first idea focused on data and community input, and this second idea overlap. Because if you're going to have a strategy that varies based on property type and the occupants. You're going to need to know when a complaint comes in on a property, what type of property is it? So how are you going to respond? What strategy would work best? And then kind of providing a high-level summary, for vacant and abandoned properties, you want to focus on strategies that reduce harm to the neighborhood, like using public funds to abate nuisances, board or demolish the properties, and exploring tools that transfer to new owners. Great. For homeowners, for most homeowners, you're really going to want to focus on education and assistance. So you're going to want to focus on sending out warning letters before conducting inspections that are easy to read and understand. If you know the properties in a neighborhood where most of the residents don't speak English as their first language, you might want to consider having that warning letter translated. And also, for all warning letters, including information about repair resources, who can this homeowner reach out to for assistance? Is there grant or loan funds available through the city or nonprofits? Is there free, paint or someone to help them mow the lawn? Any resources that you can gather from the community, put those on flyers that go out with the warning letters and make this information available to homeowners. This recommendation is backed up by the research. So there was a 2020 study that showed that sending an easy to understand courtesy letter before doing an inspection with information about resources to help with the violation improved compliance by 14.7%. And the same study found that if you send a preemptive postcard to properties that had previous violations the previous year. So, someone with high weeds and grass one summer, the next spring, you send a reminder like, hey, please remember to cut your grass. Here are some resources to help with that. That increased compliance by 19.2%. So I'll put the link to that study in the chat. Great. And another strategy to help with owner-occupied properties is really a focus on training, including soft skills, and providing the resources to help code enforcement officers deal with or address the non-code enforcement issues that they encounter with working with homeowners. So an example is that Chelsea, Massachusetts created a social services referral program. And through this program, code enforcement officers, if they identified an issue they couldn't address, like a need for basic assistance, like food and water and help paying energy bills, or help with repairs or mental health services, that they could, with a resident's consent, refer the residents to a dedicated social services provider that was available to provide assistance. And a study of this program found that it increased code officers' work efficiency and reduced their psychological burden. And here we go. There's a link to that study. And several cities have created housing navigator programs specifically designed to connect low-income homeowners to repair assistance. So finally, rental properties. We've discussed how tenants with the most need are least likely to report conditions of disrepair. And so one strategy is focusing on proactive rental programs that allows code enforcement inspectors to get into the properties without having to rely on tenants to file complaints. It reduces the likelihood that tenants will be retaliated against because the city's coming in proactively, not in response to their complaints. And a really key part, I don't think I'll have enough time to stress this enough, but anytime that you're dealing with rental regulations or code enforcement in rental properties, you're going to run the risk of displacing tenants who are living in properties with very serious health and safety violations. And this is where, before doing any of this type of work, you'd really want to make sure that you have partnerships with social services agencies and funds available to help with relocation funds and social services if this is going to come to pass. One example is from Peoria, Illinois, has created a tenant relocation assistance fund to help tenants in this situation. And they specifically seek to recoup any funds that they have to spend on helping relocate tenants from the landlords that have the code violations. Peoria is doing a bunch of great work, moving from code enforcement to code encouragement. If you haven't already, you should check out a recent webinar they did with Community Progress about their work. And you can learn more about their tenant relocation program and their other programs as well. With strategies for rental housing, another great idea is to think about strategies that empower tenant enforcement. So tenants have their own claims when their landlords have conditions of disrepair. So one example would be a rent escrow program. They have one in LA called the REAP program, where tenants can escrow a certain amount of their rent based on the conditions of disrepair in their apartment with the city. And that money can be used by them or the landlord to make repairs or for relocation assistance if necessary. And I'll put the link to LA's REAP program in the chat. Here we go. Great. Okay, and so as you can see, a follow-up point is when you're developing any of these strategies, as you could tell from the strategies I was going through, these are strategies that are really focused on enforcement against the property, getting compliance, really having, instead of focusing on penalties against the property owner, focusing on getting the property into a compliant position. For vacant and abandoned properties, that really follows the Community Progress fix it up, pay it up, or give it up model, where you give the owners of these properties notice and an opportunity to make the repairs. If they won't make them, the city can go out and abate the problems and then assess the costs against the owner. And if they don't pay those costs, which represent the costs that are being imposed by their property against the public, then we recommend that the city take steps to transfer the properties to new ownership. And this, I'm talking about vacant, abandoned properties, not occupied properties. For rental properties, this is where we often see faceless LLCs and really focusing on strategies that get the attention of the property owners. And these are strategies that affect their bottom line, like cutting off their revenue from the property, like their rental income, diverting it through things like escrow programs, receivership, or revoking their licenses. But again, this is where tricky issues around working to make sure that tenants are not displaced is key. And with owner occupants, this idea of focusing on the property is about focusing on getting the property into compliance, helping those homeowners connect with the resources they need to make the repairs and keep their own homes healthy and safe, rather than going after them for civil and criminal penalties. Okay, and then the final basic idea is to create partnerships and collaboration within. So these are collaborations within your local government or with nonprofits externally. So internally, this could mean, if there are multiple city agencies that are going out and inspecting properties, like the housing authority, the health department, let's collaborate and consolidate those resources. For internally, that also means that if your code enforcement department doesn't have the data know-how, looking to other departments within your city that do, and working with them on that. Externally, I've listed land banks here. So the strategies of transferring vacant and abandoned properties to new ownership, land banks can play a critical role of being the entity that receives those properties temporarily and prepares and markets them for productive reuse. And a final one to note is an example of a great collaboration with a community organization is in Austin, Texas. Its code department provides funding and collaborates with a nonprofit that assists with tenant education and helps organize tenants in multifamily buildings to ask for and secure repairs. And those organizers are in a good position to build relationships with tenants, many of whom are recent immigrants, and many of whom English is not their first language. And they often are able to secure the repairs without the tenants ever having to file a complaint with the city, which reduces the workload and burden. And I'll put that link in here. I'm getting close to my time. So I'll wrap up quickly with how can I learn more? And if this is not your first session today, you've already heard this. But my number one recommendation, if you want to learn more, is to come to the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference. They're going to be, which is this September in Chicago, Illinois. There are going to be a lot of great panels that touch on many of the strategies and tools that I mentioned today, including ones on proactive rental inspection programs, home repairs, shifting your culture from code enforcement to code encouraging, and how to empower tenant enforcement of code enforcement. And all that said, as I said, there's no one who's doing this all right, and every city that's all right, and we're continuing to learn. So we'd love to hear from you if there's something that's working well, or if you'd like some help thinking through what might work best for your community. Our technical assistance team has even secured dedicated funding to focus on the issues of property tax and code enforcement reform. So depending on the needs of your community, we might be able to offer assistance through our technical assistance program for equitable recovery, TAPER, or on a fee for service basis. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I'll post a link here with more information about those services and how to contact us. So now I'll open it up for questions. Let me see. I'm trying to look through here to see if anyone had. A good question here is, aside from relocation fund, what else can cities do to ensure tenants aren't displaced after condemnations? I think that's a really great question. Ideas I have off the top of my head are connecting tenants with to legal aid providers that might be able to help them bring and leverage their own claims. There are also some programs across. Yeah, that's the only idea I have right now. But let me look for some other questions. Let's see. Great. A question that we often, let me see. Great. A question that we often get. IPMC. A question that we also get is how can our code enforcement department afford to do this if we barely have the resources to do what we're doing right now? And I think that it's really important to think about when you're having these conversations about needing to move to strategic code enforcement, to stress that there's a cost to the status quo. And so going back to that Gary and Deanna slide, that there are costs in the inefficiencies of the current system, and that strategic code enforcement is really about redeploying those existing resources to get more compliance with the same amount of resources. And so you might need to invest more resources on the front end, focusing on taking the time to gather and analyze the data and community input. But in the long run, hopefully you'll see the results of more efficient, equitable code enforcement. Great. Let's see. Sherry has a question. Does the IPMC seems to be really focused on the health and safety of citizens? Would you agree? And I think you're referring to the International Property Maintenance Code. And I would agree that that is a great starting point. That is a great starting point for having a good code that can ensure the health and safety of your residents. There's also a really great tool, which I'm going to put in the chat, by the National Center for Healthy Housing. I'm just putting a link to their website in the chat, but they have a great code comparison tool where they have created a code that really focuses, if you're thinking about rental housing, on the really key concerns in rental housing that affect health and safety, like lead and asbestos and mold. And so you can take you can use your own tool. You can take your own code and compare it to their model and see how it lines up and where there are gaps that might need to be filled. Great. Let me just keep looking through for more. Go back to the beginning for more questions here. Great. Does anyone have any additional questions? I don't. Justin, if you see any additional questions that I should address, let me know. Great. If not, you can always reach out to me at any time. I'll put my email here in the chat. Great. Oh, Melinda has a great question, which is, other than measurement tools, what have you seen to measure what other measurement tools have you seen other than case numbers? And I think that the big measurement would be compliance. So I think it would be time to compliance. So if you're measuring complaints to compliance, you really want to start measuring how long does it take. So if you are having fewer cases, so if the complaints that come in, if you're having fewer cases that are lingering on, that you're able to connect homeowners with those repair resources sooner, you're able to show that that it's more efficient. So I think really focusing on using compliance as a mechanism to measure success instead of just case numbers. Oh, Christopher Mosley has a great question. Are there any cities that have a code enforcement court? Yes. So in a lot of cities, this looks like many cities have the capacity to create administrative hearings. administrative hearings instead of going to your state courts. And this can be a mechanism to provide more flexibility and to connect property owners with resources. So, this is keeping cases out of the state criminal system or the state civil system. And, the hearings are often more informal, and oftentimes cities can hire a hearing officer that has more expertise in these issues. On the other side, the other alternative is that we see cities that have created housing courts. So there are housing courts that cover the entire state of Massachusetts, and they're also used a lot in Ohio, and Memphis has one as well. And these housing courts are often where you'll find housing specialists or housing navigators to connect homeowners to resources. And there's often also diversion programs where if property owners show up and are bringing their properties into compliance, their cases can be dismissed. Great. Yes, the slides, the links on the slides will be shared when the slides are shared with everyone. Great. Well, I cannot thank you all enough for joining us, and I hope that the resources that I've been able to share and that others in the chat box have shared have been helpful to you all. And again, we're just really excited about this movement across the country to move towards more strategic code enforcement. And we hope that you do not hesitate to reach out to us with questions or to share things that are working, and that we hope to see you on other webinars and at the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference this fall. So thank you so much.